Is this the actual burial cloth of Jesus Christ or the most elaborate forgery in history? This is the Shroud of Turin, a 14-foot-long piece of ancient linen that holds the faint, haunting image of a crucified man. For centuries, this single artifact has stood at the explosive crossroads of faith and reason, captivating believers and challenging scientists in equal measure. By the end of this exploration, you will see how new forensic discoveries are completely overturning what we thought we knew. We are going to examine how pollen from Jerusalem, blood chemistry from a tortured body, and an image encoded with impossible three-dimensional data are rewriting the entire debate. This is a journey through sacred mystery, historical detective work, and technology at its most cutting edge. What does it mean when an ancient object defies every modern explanation? The cloth itself is a tangible artifact of quiet power. Measuring 14 feet in length and 3.5 feet wide, this ancient linen sheet holds the faint, straw-colored imprint of a man. The image shows his front and back as if a body was laid on one half of the cloth and the other half was drawn up over the head and down to the feet. The figure is that of a crucified man with wounds on the wrists and feet, a gash in the side, and marks across the back consistent with a brutal Roman flagrum, a whip designed to tear flesh. These injuries align with the biblical accounts of the Passion of Jesus, which is why this object carries such immense weight for millions, yet the image is not a painting. It contains no pigments, no brushstrokes, and no dyes. The coloration exists only on the very topmost microfibers of the linen threads, a superficial change more akin to a scorch or a chemical alteration than any known artistic technique. This is the core of the mystery. How was this made? The shroud's documented history begins in the 1350s in the small French town of Liéry, where it was displayed by a knight named Geoffrey de Charny. Its journey before that moment is shrouded in silence and legend, with some traditions suggesting it traveled from Jerusalem through centuries of hiding. For over 600 years since its appearance in France, it has been owned by the House of Savoy and has resided since 1997 in the specially designed climate-controlled chapel of the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. It is this combination of sacred resonance and physical impossibility that has fueled the debate for generations. Here is an object with a clear, if mysterious, historical paper trail, bearing an image that no one, even today, can fully explain how to replicate. For decades, the scientific world believed it had delivered the final, irrefutable verdict on the shroud. The year was 1988, and in a highly publicized event coordinated by the British Museum, 3 of the world's most prestigious laboratories were given a single task. They each received a small postage stamp-sized sample cut from a corner of the linen. Using the then state-of-the-art technique of radiocarbon dating, they measured the decay of carbon-14 atoms within the flax fibers. The results, announced simultaneously and with great fanfare, were clear and unanimous. The linen of the Shroud of Turin, they concluded, originated between the years 1260 and 1390. This placed its creation firmly in the medieval period, centuries after the crucifixion of Jesus. To much of the public and the press, the mystery was solved. The shroud was a clever, albeit beautiful, forgery created in the Middle Ages. It was a relic of faith, not of history, and science had spoken. The case appeared closed. Yet almost from the moment the results were published, a chorus of expert voices rose in dissent, pointing to what they saw as fatal flaws in the testing process. The primary criticism was devastatingly simple. The sample, they argued, was not representative of the original cloth. Centuries of handling, including a devastating fire in the chapel at Chambéry, France in 1532, had caused the edges of the shroud to be damaged and repeatedly repaired. Skeptical researchers proposed that the tiny piece sent to the labs was not from the 1st century core fabric, but from an invisible medieval patch skillfully rewoven into the corner by nuns repairing the fire damage. Furthermore, the fire itself introduced another variable. Intense heat and the subsequent dousing with water could have deposited a layer of newer carbon onto the ancient fibers, a contamination that would make the linen appear hundreds of years younger than it actually was. This single test, meant to provide definitive closure, instead ignited the central conflict of modern shroud research, a deep and enduring rift between a seemingly clear scientific result and a growing body of physical evidence that simply would not fit the medieval narrative. But the story of that carbon-14 test was far from over. A quiet revolution was brewing in laboratories far from the spotlight, driven by a simple question. What if the sample itself was the problem? This question consumed a dedicated group of researchers, most notably the late chemist Ray Rogers, a former project leader for the Los Alamos National Laboratory. Rogers was no true believer in the shroud's authenticity, but he was a meticulous scientist, and the inconsistencies in the data bothered him. He managed to obtain a few precious threads, not from the main body of the shroud, but from the exact same corner area where the infamous radiocarbon sample had been cut. His microscopic and chemical analysis revealed something startling. These threads were fundamentally different from the rest of the cloth. First, Rogers found traces of cotton mixed in with the linen. The main body of the shroud is pure linen made from flax, but this sample area contained cotton fibers, a material common in medieval Europe but not in 1st century Judea. More crucially, he discovered a coating on these threads, a complex substance made from gum and dye. This coating, he argued, was not some accidental contamination. It was the telltale signature of a skilled medieval repair. Here is how the theory works. After the fire of 1532, the shroud's edges were charred and fragile. Nuns tasked with preserving the sacred relic would have performed what is known as an invisible reweave. They would take threads from a piece of medieval cloth, dye them to perfectly match the aged color of the shroud, and then use gum to secure them as they painstakingly rewove the damaged section. To the naked eye, even under moderate magnification, the repair would be virtually undetectable, but chemically, the repaired section was a modern island on an ancient sea of cloth. Rogers concluded that the tiny postage stamp sample sent to the carbon dating labs in 1988 was cut entirely from one of these clever, nearly invisible patches. They had not dated the original shroud linen at all. They had dated a medieval repair job. If Rogers was correct, the entire foundation of the medieval forgery theory crumbled because the most famous piece of evidence against the shroud was suddenly evidence of nothing more than a careful restoration centuries after its creation. This was not faith arguing with science. This was science arguing with science, and it reopened a case the world had thought was closed for good. While the debate over the carbon dating raged, other forms of evidence were quietly emerging from the cloth itself, evidence that spoke not of medieval France but of ancient Judea. This evidence came from the fields and the rocks, from the very landscape of Jerusalem. In the 1970s, a Swiss criminologist named Max Frey was granted permission to take tape samples from the surface of the shroud. Under his microscope, he discovered something extraordinary trapped in the fiber's pollen grains. Pollen is incredibly durable and species-specific, acting as a microscopic fingerprint of a plant's location. Frey identified numerous pollen grains from plants that grow only in a very specific region, the area around Jerusalem. Among them was pollen from a rugged, spiky plant called Gundelia tournefortii. This is not a common European flower. It is a desert plant native to the Middle East. Intriguingly, researchers later claimed that images of this plant's distinctive thorny branches could even be seen, faintly, on the cloth itself, as if a crown of thorns had been pressed into the linen. The pollen evidence suggested the shroud had been exposed to the air in Jerusalem, a fact completely at odds with a medieval European origin. The geological evidence was just as compelling. Other scientists, using advanced techniques, identified microscopic particles of limestone, a type of rock, embedded in the fibers around the feet area of the image. This wasn't just any limestone. Its chemical signature matched a very specific variety found in the burial caves around Jerusalem. These are caves carved from a geological formation known as the Jerusalem stone. The presence of this specific limestone dust on the feet of the image man suggests a person who had walked through or been laid within a Jerusalem tomb. A medieval forger in France would have had no knowledge of this unique mineralogy and no way to obtain its dust to sprinkle convincingly onto a fake relic. Perhaps the most forensically startling evidence comes from the stains themselves, the dark reddish marks that correspond to the wounds. For a long time, skeptics argued these were simply painted with some form of medieval pigment. But detailed spectroscopic analysis revealed something far more complex. The stains contained traces of bilirubin and creatinine. Bilirubin is a compound that increases in the blood when a body is under immense physical stress and trauma. Creatinine is a marker associated with severe muscle breakdown, exactly what would happen during a brutal scourging and crucifixion. Furthermore, the stains show a very specific forensic detail, a clear serum halo. When real blood clots, the red cells clump together in the center, while a clear yellowish fluid called serum separates and soaks into the fabric around the edges, creating a ring. This is exactly what scientists see under magnification on the shroud's wounds. A medieval artist working with red paint or even animal blood would have had no concept of this microscopic biological process. They would have painted a simple, solid blot. The presence of these forensic markers points not to an artist with a brush, but to a body that endured profound physiological trauma. Each of these clues, the pollen from Jerusalem's air, the limestone from its tombs, and the blood chemistry of a tortured man, forms a chain of material evidence that pulls the shroud's origin away from 14th century Europe and anchors it firmly in 1st century Judea. Yet the greatest mystery, the one that defies all easy explanation, was still waiting to be revealed, and it was hidden in the very nature of the image itself. But the most baffling piece of this entire puzzle is not what is on the cloth, but how it got there in the first place. The image of the man is not a painting or a stain in any conventional sense. It possesses three properties that, taken together, make it utterly unique in the known world. First, the image on the cloth is a perfect photographic negative. In 1898, an amateur photographer named Secondo Pier was shocked to discover that when he developed his glass plate negatives of the shroud, the result was not a negative image, but a startlingly clear and detailed positive portrait. The faint, straw-colored markings on the linen had somehow encoded a full tonal range of light and shadow, revealing the serene, three-dimensional face of a man with wounds and bloodstains. This means that for centuries, people were looking at the negative of a picture they could not see. Second, the coloration is not an applied substance. It exists only on the very topmost microfibers of the individual linen threads, a layer less than half a micrometer thick. There is no penetration of color into the threads, no brush strokes, and no capillary flow of any liquid. It is as if the surface of the cloth was very lightly scorched or chemically altered in a precise pattern. Third, the image contains precise three-dimensional information. When scientists at NASA in the 1970s used a VP8 image analyzer, a device designed to map the topography of planetary surfaces from photographs, they made a stunning discovery. Feeding the shroud's negative image into the analyzer produced a perfectly coherent, three-dimensional relief of a human body. Normal photographs or paintings produce distorted, lumpy results when subjected to this process because they are two-dimensional representations of light and shadow. The shroud's image, however, behaves as if the intensity of its coloration is directly proportional to the distance between the cloth and the body it covered. The nose is darker because it was closer, the eye sockets are lighter because they were farther away. This is data, not art. So how do you create a perfect, superficial, three-dimensional, photographic negative image on linen without any known artistic technology? The leading naturalistic theory points to a slow, chemical process known as the Maillard reaction. This is the same reaction that browns toast or sears a steak. In this scenario, the amines, which are volatile organic compounds released from a decomposing body, would interact with the carbohydrate sugars present in the linen fibers. Over time, this reaction could theoretically produce the faint, straw-colored image we see. But this theory faces serious hurdles. A decomposing body in direct contact with cloth would create a distorted, blurry image from direct diffusion, not the crisp, three-dimensional data map we observe. The image is also far too superficial, and the process would likely be disrupted by the presence of the bloodstains. The other, more radical hypothesis suggests the image was formed in an instant, not over days. This is the radiation hypothesis. Some scientists propose that a short, intense, and directional burst of energy, perhaps a form of light or particle radiation emanating from the body itself, could have caused a rapid dehydration and oxidation of the linen's surface fibers. This burst, lasting perhaps a microsecond, would have scorched the cloth in direct proportion to the distance from the body, perfectly encoding the three-dimensional information. While this sounds like science fiction, it is one of the few proposed mechanisms that accounts for the image superficiality, its perfect negative characteristics, and its precise three-dimensional encoding. Yet what natural source could produce such a burst of energy from a human corpse? This question leads us from the realm of pure material science into a deeper, more profound mystery. This brings us to the most rigorous scientific examination of the cloth in over 40 years. In 2019, a new generation of researchers, operating under the banner of the Shroud of Turin Research Project 2, was granted unprecedented access. Armed with tools far more powerful than those available in the 1970s, they aimed to settle the debate with hard data, not speculation. Their mission was to analyze the very chemistry of the image at a microscopic level to finally understand what it is made of. Using techniques like Raman spectroscopy and advanced electron microscopy, they didn't just look at the cloth, they listened to its molecular vibrations. The findings were definitive, and they ruled out any form of artistic forgery. The colored image fibers showed clear chemical signatures of oxidation and dehydration. In plain terms, the cellulose that makes up the linen had been altered by a process that removed hydrogen and oxygen atoms, leaving behind a brittle, discolored structure. This is not what happens when you apply paint, dye, or any known medieval pigment. Those substances add material to the fibers. The image on the shroud is the result of a subtraction, a fundamental change to the linen itself, like the slow yellowing of an old book page or the precise scorch from a burst of heat. It is the fingerprint of an aging process, something that happened to the cloth, not something that was put on it. But the team discovered something else, something hidden among the threads that spoke volumes about geography and history. Clinging to the fibers were submicron particles, specks of dust so small they are invisible to the human eye. Chemical analysis identified this dust as travertine aragonite, a very specific form of limestone. This is not generic rock dust. Its chemical fingerprint matched limestone found in ancient burial caves around Jerusalem, the same Jerusalem stone identified in earlier studies. Think of it as geological DNA. A medieval forger in France could fake a painting, but they could not fake the microscopic geology of a land over 2,000 miles away. The presence of this specific limestone, embedded in the same fibers that bear the chemically altered image, creates a powerful convergence of evidence. It places the cloth, physically and undeniably, in the exact historical and environmental context described by its tradition. The image was formed by a mysterious process that altered the linen's chemistry, and the cloth itself collected the dust of a first-century Judean tomb. This modern analysis doesn't just challenge the forgery theory, it systematically dismantles it by providing a material witness from the ancient world. The blood on the cloth tells its own brutal story, one written in a language of biochemistry and forensic detail. Across the back, shoulders, and legs of the image are over 100 small, dumbbell-shaped markings, each one a perfect match for the wounds inflicted by a Roman flagrum. This was not a simple whip, but a multi-tailed lash tipped with pieces of bone or lead designed to tear into the flesh. The pattern on the cloth shows these wounds precisely where historical accounts say Roman soldiers would strike, across the back and the backs of the legs. At the head, we see a trickle of blood from dozens of puncture points, forming the distinct pattern of a cap of thorns, not a simple circlet. A large, elliptical wound stains the right side of the chest, consistent with a post-mortem thrust from a Roman lance. Most tellingly, the nail wounds are at the wrists, not the palms. Modern forensic science and experiments with cadavers have shown that a nail driven through the palm would tear through the soft tissue under the weight of a body, causing it to fall from the cross. The bones of the wrist, however, provide a solid anchor, a grim anatomical fact unknown to medieval artists who consistently depicted the nail wounds in the hands. The shroud gets this brutal, technical detail correct, but the true forensic revolution lies in what that blood is made of. Using advanced spectroscopic techniques, researchers have repeatedly identified the presence of hemoglobin, the oxygen-carrying protein in blood, and its breakdown products like heme and porphyrin. These are the complex molecular signatures of real blood, not simple pigments. Under high-powered microscopes, the bloodstains reveal an even more convincing detail, the clear serum halos we mentioned earlier. When real blood clots outside the body, the red cells concentrate in the center while a clear, yellowish fluid separates and soaks into the fabric, leaving a faint ring around the stain's edge. This is exactly what scientists see on the shroud. A medieval painter aiming for a dramatic effect would have applied a uniform red pigment. They would have had no knowledge of this microscopic biological process, no reason to paint a perfect, invisible halo only detectable with 20th century technology. Skeptics, however, point to another finding, the purported detection of iron oxide, specifically in the form of red ochre, a common medieval pigment. This seems like a damning piece of evidence for a forgery, but proponents counter with a fascinating biochemical argument. When very old blood degrades over centuries, the iron from the hemoglobin molecules can indeed bind with minerals and transform into iron oxide compounds that are chemically identical to red ochre. In other words, what looks like a painter's pigment could actually be the final, mineralized footprint of authentic, ancient blood. The debate hinges on this complex transformation, making a definitive chemical verdict incredibly difficult. Yet the totality of the evidence, the precise wound locations, the forensic serum rings, and the presence of blood proteins builds a picture that is anatomically and biochemically coherent in a way no medieval artwork should be. The bloodstains behave less like applied paint and more like the detailed, tragic record of a specific and horrific execution. This three-dimensional data is the single most confounding feature of the entire cloth. To understand why, we must travel back to the 1970s, to a laboratory where two scientists made a discovery so unexpected it changed the entire trajectory of shroud research. Physicist John Jackson and photographer Eric Jumper were examining high-quality negatives of the shroud when they had a radical idea. They decided to borrow a piece of technology from the space program, a device called a VP8 image analyzer. This machine was designed for a very specific purpose, to take the light and shadow data from satellite photographs of the Moon or Mars and convert it into accurate topographic maps, showing the height of mountains and the depth of craters. The VP8 operates on a simple principle. It interprets variations in image brightness as variations in physical distance. In a landscape photo, a bright area is a sunlit mountaintop. A dark area is a shadowed valley. The machine reads this brightness data and builds a three-dimensional model. Jackson and Jumper fed the shroud's photographic negative into the VP8. What they expected was a garbled, meaningless mess. After all, they were analyzing a picture of a piece of cloth, not a planetary surface. What they saw on the screen left them stunned. The machine did not produce a chaotic jumble of shapes. Instead, it rendered a perfectly coherent, anatomically correct three-dimensional sculpture of a human form. The nose projected properly, the eye sockets receded, the cheekbones and hands all fell into their correct spatial relationships. It was as if the machine had been given a precise distance map, a record of exactly how far every point on the cloth was from the body it once covered. To prove how extraordinary this result was, they ran a control test. They took a standard portrait photograph, a high-quality image of a human face, and fed it into the same VP8 analyzer. The result was a grotesque, distorted relief. The eyes bulged out like potatoes, the nose melted into the cheeks, and the features were utterly unrecognizable. This happens because a normal photograph is a two-dimensional trick of light and shadow. An artist uses highlights and lowlights to create the illusion of depth, but those highlights do not correspond to exact physical measurements. The VP8 interprets a painted highlight on a cheekbone as if it were a physical peak, creating a lumpy, impossible landscape. The shroud's image contains no such artistic cues. Its variations in color intensity are not an artist's interpretation, they are pure data. The darkness of a point on the image corresponds directly to the distance between that point on the cloth and the part of the body beneath it. Where the cloth was in close contact, like the nose and the forehead, the image is darker. Where there was a gap, like the hollows of the eyes or the space between the arms and the torso, the image is lighter. This is a level of information encoding that is completely unprecedented in any artwork from any era. A medieval forger, no matter how skilled, would have been working with a flat piece of linen and a mind trained in two-dimensional representation. The very concept of encoding a perfect three-dimensional distance map into the fabric of a cloth, a map only decipherable by a 20th century space-age computer, is a technological absurdity. It suggests the image was not made by human hands at all, but was somehow transferred directly from a three-dimensional object through a process that recorded spatial reality with absolute mechanical precision. The very fabric of the shroud holds secrets of its own. To truly understand this object, we must look at it not just as an image, but as a piece of ancient cloth, a textile artifact with a story woven into its threads. The linen of the shroud is not a simple, plain weave. It is a sophisticated 3-to-1 herringbone twill. This means the threads are woven in a diagonal, zigzag pattern, a technique that produces a stronger, more durable fabric. For a long time, this complex weave was pointed to by skeptics as evidence of a medieval origin, as such patterns were certainly known in Europe during the Middle Ages. But textile archaeology has delivered a surprising twist. Excavations at ancient sites have revealed that this specific 3-to-1 herringbone twill was not a medieval invention. In fact, fragments of linen with this exact weave pattern have been discovered at Masada, the famous Jewish fortress overlooking the Dead Sea. Masada fell to the Romans in the year 73, a date firmly within the 1st century. This discovery proves that the type of cloth used for the shroud was not only possible in the ancient world, it was actually being produced in the very region and during the very time period in question. So the weave alone cannot condemn the shroud as a medieval fake. It simply places it within a known historical context, a context that includes 1st century Judea. The debate over the weave, however, is a perfect example of how evidence can be interpreted in different ways. While the Masada fragments show the pattern existed, they don't prove the shroud itself is from that era. Critics rightly note that herringbone twills were also woven for centuries afterward across Europe and the Mediterranean. The cloth itself is a silent witness, and its weave alone cannot give a definitive date. But another clue, this one hidden in a supporting fabric, adds a crucial piece to the puzzle. Centuries after its creation, the shroud was backed with a separate piece of cloth, a reinforcement known as the Holland cloth. In 2002, researchers conducting a meticulous examination made a startling discovery on this backing cloth. They found microscopic traces of a specific dye. This was not just any red colorant, it was from the root of the Rubia tinctorum plant, commonly known as madder. Madder root was a widely used dye in the ancient world, but its importance here is geographic. The chemical signature of the dye particles found on the shroud's backing cloth matched samples of madder dye known to have been used specifically in the ancient Levant, the region encompassing modern-day Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. This is a small, almost forensic detail, but its implications are significant. The Holland backing cloth was attached to the shroud in the 1500s, long after its first appearance in France. The presence of this specific Levantine madder dye on a 16th century European cloth suggests a fascinating possibility that the threads or materials used for this repair job might have been sourced from a much older textile, perhaps one that had been in contact with the shroud for a long time, or even from the Holy Land itself. It is a whisper from the past, a tiny chemical signature that once again points the compass east toward Jerusalem. When we combine the evidence of the weave with this trace of ancient dye, the shroud ceases to be just a mysterious image. It becomes an archaeological artifact, a piece of material culture whose very threads seem to carry the dust and the colors of a distant time and place. Yet another piece of ancient linen kept in a cathedral in northern Spain tells a parallel story. This is the sudarium of Oviedo, a much smaller cloth, roughly 34 by 21 inches, darkened by severe stains and kept in a reliquary for over 1,000 years. Its tradition is stark and specific. It is said to be the face cloth mentioned in the Gospel of John, the cloth that was placed over the head of Jesus after his death before the full body was wrapped in the burial shroud. Unlike the Shroud of Turin, the sudarium bears no image, only a complex pattern of stains, primarily blood and pulmonary edema fluid, the fluid from the lungs that can emerge after a traumatic death. For centuries, these two relics were studied separately, their connection only a matter of faith. Then, forensic science brought them together in a way no one could have anticipated. Researchers meticulously mapped the stain patterns on the sudarium, which show a clear flow from the nose and mouth, consistent with a body in a vertical position, then laid on its back and later folded. When they superimposed this pattern over the image of the face on the Shroud of Turin, the alignment was precise. The stains on the face cloth correspond exactly to the wounds visible on the shroud's forehead and the streams of blood from the scalp. It is as if the two cloths were used on the same injured head in sequence, one after the other. The biological evidence deepens the connection. Both cloths have been tested for blood type, and both reveal the same rare group, type AB, a type common in the Middle East but far less so in medieval Europe. Even more compelling, pollen analysis conducted on the sudarium identified the same specific grains found on the shroud, including once again the pollen of Gundelia tournefortii, the Jerusalem thorn plant. This small, unadorned cloth from Oviedo, with its own independent history and veneration, acts as a silent material witness. It carries no mysterious image to debate, only the brutal, biological facts of a death by crucifixion. That its forensic and botanical evidence points not only to 1st century Palestine, but directly to the same specific wounds and location as the shroud, is a coincidence of staggering proportions. One relic could perhaps be an elaborate enigma, but two, separated by geography and tradition, now linked by science, begin to form a chain of evidence that is far harder to dismiss. But where was the shroud before it surfaced in France in the 1350s? Its sudden appearance seems to defy history, yet a tantalizing trail of clues leads us back centuries earlier to a legendary object that vanished from the historical record. This is the story of the image of Edessa, also known as the Mandilion, According to ancient Byzantine accounts, this was a cloth upon which Christ himself had imprinted his face, a holy icon sent to heal a king. It first appears in reliable historical records in the year 544, when it was discovered hidden within the walls of the city of Edessa in modern-day Turkey. For centuries, this sacred cloth was one of the most venerated relics of the Byzantine Empire. Then, in the year 944, it was transferred with immense ceremony to the capital, Constantinople. And there, after the Fourth Crusade sacked the city in 1204, it disappears from history. The timeline is provocative. The Mandylion vanishes from Constantinople, and roughly 150 years later, the shroud appears in France. Could they be the same object? Historian Ian Wilson proposed a compelling theory that connects these two mysterious cloths. He suggested the Mandylion was not simply a small face cloth, but was in fact the Shroud of Turin, folded in such a way that only the face was visible. Imagine a large linen sheet folded over and over again, and then placed inside a frame or a reliquary. What would an observer see? Only the square of fabric containing the haunting face, the rest of the body's image hidden away in the folds. This would explain why early descriptions of the Mandylion mention only a face, and why it was always described as being on a cloth, not as a painting. But some accounts from Constantinople hint at something more. A 12th century writer describing the relic kept in the imperial palace noted it was not just a face but a full-length image of the Lord. Another account from the same era mentions a sindon, which is the Greek word for a large shroud or burial cloth. These are fleeting references, easily overlooked, but they suggest a profound secret was being kept. The full, shocking image of a crucified man may have been considered too powerful, too theologically dangerous to be revealed to the public. It was easier and perhaps safer to venerate it as a simple, miraculous portrait. This theory of the folded shroud solves several historical puzzles at once. It gives the Turin cloth a documented history stretching back over 1,000 years before its appearance in France. It explains why the shroud's existence seems to burst into the historical record fully formed, with no artistic precedent, and it provides a plausible reason for its disappearance, looted from Constantinople by crusading knights, perhaps even by the ancestors of Geoffrey de Charny, the man who first displayed it in Liary. The journey from Edessa to Constantinople and then into the chaos of the Crusades is a shadowy path, but it is a path that history allows. If Wilson's hypothesis is correct, then the Shroud of Turin is not a medieval invention, but a rediscovered ancient treasure, its true identity concealed within its own folds for centuries. The year was 1532, and the shroud was resting in a place of supreme honor, the private chapel of the Dukes of Savoy in Chambéry, France. This chapel, the Sainte-Chapelle, was built to house the precious relic secured within an elaborate silver casket. But on the night of December 4th, disaster struck. A fire, its origin lost to time, erupted within the chapel walls. Flames quickly spread, licking toward the altar where the silver chest sat. The heat became so intense that the silver itself began to melt. Molten metal, dripping like liquid fire, fell directly onto the corner of the iron strongbox containing the cloth. Inside that box, folded within its layers, was the linen. The heat was not direct enough to reduce it to ashes, but it was more than enough to scorch it severely. We can almost hear the panic, the shouts, as someone, likely a quick-thinking cleric or guard, rushed into the inferno. They did not have time to fumble with locks or keys. The only way to save the relic was to douse the blazing reliquary with water, likely from a bucket. The water extinguished the flames, but it also soaked the scorched linen, causing further damage. When the cloth was finally retrieved from the damaged casket, the toll was clear. A series of large, symmetrical burn holes now marked the linen, arranged in a distinctive L-shaped pattern where the folded corners had been seared by the dripping silver. Surrounding these holes were large, dark water stains, the ghostly imprint of that desperate rescue. this single night in Chambéry did two profound things to the shroud. First, it permanently altered its physical appearance, adding the scars that are now an undeniable part of its identity. The burn marks and water stains are as much a part of the shroud's story as the image itself, a testament to its perilous journey through history. But second, and far more consequential for modern science, this event created a perfect storm for contamination. The intense heat and the subsequent dousing introduced a cascade of foreign material. Carbon from the smoke and soot of the burning chapel, along with modern carbon from the water used to fight the fire, could have been driven deep into the linen fibers. Furthermore, the damaged edges of the cloth, charred and brittle, would have required repair. This is where the theory of the invisible medieval reweave gains its strongest footing. Nuns of the Poor Clare order, renowned for their needlework, were tasked with restoring the sacred cloth. To repair the fire-damaged areas, they would have carefully rewoven new threads into the ancient fabric, matching the color and weave as closely as possible. These new threads, coming from 14th or 15th century flax, would carry a completely different radiocarbon signature than the original 1st century linen. If the tiny sample cut in 1988 was taken from one of these expertly repaired sections, then the famous carbon dating did not test the shroud at all. It tested a patch from the 1500s. The fire of 1532, therefore, is not just a dramatic footnote. It is the central, chaotic event that may have misdirected science for a generation, wrapping the true age of the linen in a layer of medieval soot, water, and thread. The fire damage and historical repairs presented a formidable obstacle to understanding the true image, but 21st century technology has given researchers a new kind of vision. By applying tools like multispectral imaging and artificial intelligence, scientists are now peeling back the layers of time, digitally removing the scars of centuries to see the shroud as it was before the flames ever touched it. One of the most significant projects involved capturing the entire cloth in staggering detail, using high-resolution cameras to create a digital file containing over 100 billion pixels. This allowed for an unprecedented microscopic examination of every thread and stain from anywhere in the world, but the real breakthrough came with algorithmic processing. Researchers developed sophisticated computer programs designed to perform a virtual restoration. These algorithms were instructed to identify and subtract the patterns of the 1532 fire burns and the subsequent water stains. It was a digital archaeology, carefully scraping away the soot and the tide lines of the Chambéry fire. What remained when those later additions were removed was startling. The underlying image of the body appeared with greater clarity and contrast. The wounds from the scourging, those dozens of dumbbell-shaped marks across the back and legs, became more distinct. The blood flows from the wrists and side showed finer detail, and the features of the face emerged with a subtlety that was previously obscured by the dark patches of water damage. This cleaned image provided forensic experts with a clearer map of the trauma, reinforcing the anatomical precision of the wounds. Beyond simple cleanup, artificial intelligence is being tasked with an even more profound question: how was this image made? In recent studies, researchers have fed vast databases of images into machine learning models. These databases included photographs of paintings, chemical stains, scorch marks, and contact impressions from sculptures. The AI was trained to recognize the visual fingerprints of different creation processes. When the shroud's image was finally presented to these intelligent systems, the results were consistent and intriguing. The algorithms consistently classified the shroud's image as an outlier. Its pattern of coloration, its lack of directional strokes, and its unique relationship between light and dark did not match the profiles of any known artistic technique from any historical period. The AI could not point to a specific natural process, but it could confidently say what the image was not. It was not painted, printed, or dyed by human hands using any method the machine had learned. This digital verdict echoes the physical one. The image formation mechanism remains unknown. This fusion of ancient linen and cutting-edge code pushes the mystery into a new realm. We are no longer just looking at a cloth, we are conversing with it through algorithms, asking it questions in the language of data. The answers we get back continue to point toward a profound and enduring enigma, an object that sits comfortably in the 1st century yet consistently defies explanation by the technology of any century since. Roman crucifixion was a brutally efficient form of public execution, designed to inflict maximum suffering and humiliation. Historical accounts from writers like Josephus describe it in grim detail, but for centuries our understanding lacked physical proof. That changed in 1968 with a chilling archaeological discovery in Jerusalem. Workers unearthed a 1st century ossuary, a bone box inscribed with the name Yehohanan, the son of Haggakol. Inside were the skeletal remains of a man in his 20s, and still embedded in his right heel bone was a 7-inch iron nail. The nail had been driven through a small wooden plaque, likely an acacia block, to prevent the condemned from tearing his feet free. This single, terrible artifact confirmed the mechanics of crucifixion in the most visceral way possible, providing a direct point of comparison for the wounds on the Shroud of Turin. The image on the linen shows the nail wounds not in the palms as depicted in almost all medieval and Renaissance art, but at the wrists. This is a critical forensic detail. The palms lack the sturdy bone structure to support the weight of a human body, which would cause the hands to tear open. The wrist, however, contains a strong cluster of bones called the carpal bones. Driving a nail between the radius and ulnar bones of the forearm, or through the carpal tunnel itself, creates a solid anchor that can bear the load. This anatomical fact was unknown to medieval artists who worked from theological tradition and earlier artwork, not from the grim reality of Roman execution methods. The shroud gets this gruesomely technical point correct. Another telling detail is the condition of the legs. Roman practice often included a finishing blow called the crurifragium, the breaking of the legs with a heavy club. This hastened death by preventing the victim from pushing up to breathe, leading to suffocation. The Gospel of John specifically notes that the legs of the 2 thieves crucified alongside Jesus were broken, but that his legs were left intact because he was already dead. The image on the shroud shows no evidence of broken bones in the lower limbs. The legs are straight and unmarred by the massive trauma that would have been obvious, aligning perfectly with that specific historical account. Then there is the lance wound. The image shows a large, elliptical flow of blood and serum on the right side of the chest. This matches the biblical description of a Roman soldier thrusting a spear into Jesus' side. Forensic analysis suggests the wound penetrated between the 5th and 6th ribs, a path that would have pierced the pericardial sac around the heart, releasing a flow of blood and watery fluid. This is not a random stab wound. It is a precise injury consistent with a post-mortem thrust to confirm death, and its location and the nature of the stain are forensically coherent. The totality of these wounds presents a striking historical portrait. A medieval forger, no matter how devout, would have been working from a centuries-old artistic tradition that symbolized the passion, not from a medical textbook. They would have painted the nails in the palms because that is what every painting and sculpture showed. They might have added a spear wound, but likely as a simple slash or a symbolic dot, not a complex, anatomically specific flow between the ribs. The idea that a 14th century artist would independently discover the necessity of wrist nails, omit the leg breaking, and accurately depict a post-mortem pleural effusion from a spear thrust is a staggering coincidence. The shroud's wounds speak the cold, technical language of Roman execution, a language that was lost to history until archaeology began to whisper it back to us just decades ago. This alignment forces a difficult question. Are we looking at an artifact of faith created by a medieval genius with impossible knowledge? Or are we looking at something that witnessed the very events it so precisely records? The image's perfection is precisely what fuels its most compelling counterargument. If it seems too good to be true, perhaps it is not a relic at all, but a masterpiece of deception. This is the artist hypothesis, the leading skeptical theory that attempts to explain the shroud through human ingenuity rather than divine mystery. Its proponents, like researchers Walter McCrone and Joe Nickell, argue we must look at the cloth not as an object of veneration, but as a cunning piece of medieval art. They propose several methods a brilliant forger could have used. One idea involves a form of early photography using a camera obscura. In a dark room, a small hole could project an image of a model or a sculpture onto linen treated with a light-sensitive substance, perhaps silver nitrate, creating a primitive photographic negative. Another theory suggests a simple rubbing technique. A sculptor could create a bas-relief, a shallow three-dimensional statue of a crucified man. The linen, possibly soaked in a thin mixture of pigment and gelatin, could then be carefully pressed or rubbed over the raised surfaces, transferring an image whose darkness would correlate with the depth of the relief, mimicking a three-dimensional data map. A third possibility is direct painting with a very dilute iron oxide pigment, like red ochre, in a gelatin binder. Applied with a cloth or a sponge in the faintest of layers, this could create the superficial, pigment-free appearance that later oxidizes into the image we see today. Then there is the naturalistic Maillard reaction theory, which skeptics also champion. In this scenario, no forger is needed at all. A clever artist could have created a faint, preliminary image using a mixture containing organic compounds like ammonia or sweat from a human body. When this treated linen was lightly heated, perhaps over a hot statue or with a heated metal sheet, the sugars in the linen would react with the applied amines, producing the straw-colored browning in a controlled pattern. This chemical process, the same one that browns food, could theoretically produce an image that ages authentically over centuries. The sheer skill required for any of these methods is ironically a testament to the forger's genius. This hypothetical artist would have needed an advanced understanding of human anatomy to place the wounds correctly, a grasp of basic chemistry to create a lasting image, and an intuitive, almost prescient knowledge of three-dimensional encoding to produce an image that would only make sense to a 20th century computer. They would have had to invent a form of photography 600 years before its time, and then keep the technique a complete secret, never using it again. This argument asks us to believe in a different kind of miracle, the miracle of a lost medieval Leonardo da Vinci, a painter, chemist, anatomist, and optical physicist all in one, whose sole surviving masterpiece was designed to fool the faithful. It is a theory that replaces a supernatural mystery with a profoundly human one, challenging us to decide which requires the greater leap of faith. The dust trapped within its ancient weave carries more than just pollen and limestone. It holds the genetic whispers of everyone who ever touched it. In 2022, a groundbreaking study took forensic investigation to its absolute limit by analyzing the DNA vacuumed from the very surface of the shroud. Researchers didn't examine the cloth itself. They examined the microscopic ecosystem of dust, skin cells, and other particles that had settled into its fibers over countless hands and centuries. The genetic results were a map of human history. They revealed a stunning variety of human DNA haplogroups, which are broad genetic families that trace deep ancestral lineages. The dust contained markers common among populations in the Middle East, which you would expect from an object with origins near Jerusalem. But it also held markers widespread across Europe, aligning perfectly with its 600-year documented history in France and Italy. Perhaps most surprisingly, the analysis even detected genetic signatures associated with populations from India. This genetic tapestry tells a clear, if complex, story. The shroud has been handled by countless people from vastly different parts of the world over its long life. Pilgrims, priests, nobles, and restorers from Europe and beyond have all left their invisible biological signature upon it. For this reason, the study cannot point to a single geographic origin or prove the identity of the man whose image it bears. The DNA is a cumulative record, a genetic palimpsest written by everyone who came into contact with the linen, not by the one person it may have once wrapped. Yet within that limitation lies a significant clue: the presence of Middle Eastern haplogroups, including those rare outside that region, is consistent with the object having spent considerable time in the Levant. It fits the narrative of a journey beginning in the East. While the DNA cannot say, "This is the burial cloth of Jesus," it powerfully says, "This is an object that has traveled across continents, collecting the genetic dust of the world along its path." It adds a profound human dimension to the Shroud's biography, transforming it from a static icon into a living witness to centuries of devotion, curiosity, and touch. This fundamental divide is the very soul of the Shroud's enduring mystery. For millions of the faithful, the cloth is a sacred icon, a tangible connection to the divine that transcends the need for laboratory validation. Its value lies in its power to inspire contemplation, to make a distant story viscerally real. Scientific tests cannot diminish that spiritual resonance because faith operates in a realm beyond carbon atoms and spectral analysis. To a believer, the Shroud is a relic of the resurrection, a silent witness to the central miracle of Christianity. Its mysteries are not problems to be solved, but depths to be pondered. On the opposite side stands the empirical world of science, which deals in testable hypotheses and reproducible evidence. For researchers, the Shroud is simply a unique physical object, a fascinating artifact that presents a series of extraordinary technical puzzles. How was the image formed? What is the blood chemistry? Where did the pollen originate? Their mission is not to prove or disprove an article of faith, but to understand the mechanisms behind a physical phenomenon. These two perspectives often speak different languages, one of meaning and the other of mechanism, and their collision over this single piece of linen creates a volatile and endlessly fascinating tension. This tension is amplified by the very human tendency of confirmation bias, a force that affects both sides equally. A believer may instinctively embrace any scientific finding that supports authenticity, while viewing contradictory evidence with deep skepticism. A skeptical scientist convinced the Shroud is a medieval forgery might dismiss anomalous data as contamination or error, rather than a clue pointing to a more complex truth. We all have a tendency to filter information through our existing worldviews, and the Shroud, sitting squarely at the crossroads of two powerful systems of thought, becomes a perfect mirror for this very human trait. This is why the debate remains so polarized and emotionally charged. It is about more than linen and bloodstains. It is about how we know what we know and what we are willing to accept as truth. Yet the new wave of evidence, from the forensic blood chemistry to the digital image analysis, is creating a fascinating pressure on these entrenched positions. The data emerging is not simply favoring one narrative over another, it is complicating the picture entirely. It is forcing devout skeptics to confront evidence that a medieval forger would have needed impossible knowledge. Simultaneously, it is asking believers to accept that scientific scrutiny, even when it challenges tradition, is a valid path to understanding the physical history of an object they hold sacred. Both camps are being pushed toward a more nuanced middle ground, a space where respect for faith can coexist with rigorous inquiry. The Shroud, in its stubborn silence, is teaching a profound lesson about humility. It reminds us that some mysteries resist easy categorization, and that the pursuit of truth, whether through prayer or through a microscope, is a journey that never truly ends. By the late 1970s, the questions surrounding the cloth had grown too loud to ignore. The world needed more than theories, it needed data, and a group of determined scientists decided to get it. This was the Shroud of Turin research project known as STURP. For 5 days in October 1978, in a dimly lit hall of the Royal Palace in Turin, a team of over 30 American researchers worked around the clock. They brought with them 72 cases of equipment, from spectrometers and microscopes to custom-built imaging devices, all approved by the cloth's custodians for one critical purpose: to study the shroud without touching it, without cutting it, without causing a single thread of harm. They had 120 consecutive hours of access, a sliver of time to solve a centuries-old mystery. The team was a who's who of disciplines: physicists, chemists, pathologists, and photographers, each a skeptic in their own right, united by a shared commitment to follow the evidence wherever it led. They took thousands of photographs under every wavelength of light, from ultraviolet to infrared. They used sticky tape to lift microscopic samples from the surface. They analyzed the spectral fingerprints of the image and the stains, searching for the chemical truth hidden in the linen. After years of meticulous analysis back in their laboratories, they released their official report. Its conclusions sent shockwaves through both the scientific and religious communities. They stated, and I quote, "The image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The blood stains are composed of hemoglobin and give a positive test for serum albumin. Let's unpack what that meant." First, they confirmed the man was not a sculpture or a painting. The image encoded real, three-dimensional data of a human body. Second, they declared the blood was real, containing the iron-rich protein hemoglobin and surrounded by the clear serum ring, the forensic halo that forms as real blood clots. This was a monumental declaration. STURP did not and could not prove the man was Jesus Christ. Their mandate was purely physical, but what they did prove was arguably just as revolutionary. They demonstrated with the full authority of late 20th century science that the Shroud of Turin was not a medieval painting. No pigments, no brushstrokes, no artistic medium of any kind could explain the image they scrutinized. This report shattered the default assumption that had guided much of the scholarly world. It lifted the shroud out of the realm of pure art history and planted it firmly in the realm of forensic archaeology and material science. The STURP investigation became the bedrock, the foundational data set upon which all future research would build. It was the moment the mystery graduated from a question of faith into a bona fide scientific puzzle. But to truly grasp the image's strangeness, we must shrink our perspective down to the width of a human hair. Under the unforgiving eye of a scanning electron microscope, the linen fibers of the shroud reveal their most telling secrets. At this scale, the mystery becomes even more stark. The individual threads that bear the faint, straw-colored image are not uniformly colored. In fact, the coloration exists only on the very topmost microfibers, the tiniest strands that twist together to form a single thread. These surface-level fibrils, the ones that actually create the picture we see, show clear signs of degradation. They are brittle, fragile, and chemically altered, as if they had undergone a rapid aging process. It is a change akin to the way an old newspaper yellows and becomes crisp at the edges, but here the effect is impossibly precise, following the contours of a human form. The critical evidence lies in the contrast. Just beneath this brittle surface layer, the core of the linen thread remains perfectly intact. The fibers that are not part of the image show no such degradation. They are flexible, strong, and unaltered. This tells us something profound. Whatever created the image did not soak into the cloth. It did not penetrate or stain it like a liquid would. Instead, it acted only on the outermost surface, like a whisper of heat from a passing flame that singes only the very tips of the threads. This superficial alteration is one of the strongest arguments against the painting hypothesis. A medieval artist applying any form of pigment, dye, or even a thin wash would have seen the liquid wick into the spaces between the fibers, following the natural capillaries of the linen. It would have left a residue, a coating, or a penetration that microscopes would easily detect. But that is not what we see. We see a change in the material itself, a chemical transformation of the cellulose that makes up the flax, and it is a change that goes only skin deep. Adding another layer to this microscopic puzzle, researchers have identified a thin, clear coating on some of these image-bearing fibers. This coating is composed of starch fractions and polysaccharide gums, substances that are naturally present in linen. Their presence here is not random. It is a crucial clue that points directly to a specific chemical process, the Maillard reaction. You experience this reaction every time you toast bread or sear a steak. It is the browning that occurs when sugars and amino acids react under heat. On the shroud, the theory suggests that the simple sugars from this starch coating on the linen fibers reacted with nitrogen-containing compounds called amines that were released by a human body. This reaction, over time, could have produced the caramelized, straw-colored complex carbohydrates that form the image. The presence of this starch layer precisely where the image appears is like finding the leftover ingredients at the scene of a chemical event. It provides a plausible substrate, a ready source of sugar, waiting to react with something from the body. This minute, almost invisible detail is a key pillar for those arguing for a natural, corporeal origin. It suggests the image was not applied, but emerged from a slow, natural interaction between the cloth and the chemistry of a corpse. A silent, weeks-long process that left its fragile, superficial mark on the very surface of history. This leaves us with a practical, almost hands-on question. If the shroud is a medieval creation, could someone make it again today? For decades, this challenge has captivated artists, chemists, and skeptics, each attempting to prove that human ingenuity is equal to the mystery. They have set up workshops and laboratories not as acts of devotion, but as experiments in replication, trying to reverse engineer the shroud's impossible checklist of features. The attempts are as varied as they are ingenious. One popular method involves sculpture. An artist creates a detailed bas-relief of a human form, perhaps heating the statue and laying linen over it, or applying a thin mixture of pigment and gelatin to the cloth before pressing it down. The result can be a faint, ghostly image where the pigment transfers more heavily from the high points, creating a crude semblance of three-dimensional data. Another approach uses chemistry alone. Researchers have experimented with placing a linen cloth over a marble slab carved with a face, then exposing it to vapors of ammonia and aldehyde. This triggers a Maillard reaction on the cloth surface, producing a faint, straw-colored browning that follows the contours of the stone beneath it. It is a slow, chemical portrait. Others have tried to mimic the medieval forger directly, using period-appropriate materials like red ochre pigment in a thin gelatin binder, carefully daubing it onto linen to create a blood-stained image. Some have even turned to modern technology, using ultraviolet lasers or brief bursts of radiation to try and scorch an image onto linen fiber by fiber. So, what have these replications achieved? On a superficial level, several are visually striking. From a few feet away, they can look remarkably like the Shroud of Turin, capturing the general pose and the haunting quality of the face. They prove that a talented individual could have created an object that would inspire awe in the 14th century. But when subjected to the same battery of tests that scientists use on the original, every single replica fails, and it fails on multiple critical fronts at once. First, the three-dimensional encoding. While a bas-relief rubbing can create an image where darkness correlates with depth, the data is crude and distorted. When fed into a VP8 image analyzer, these replicas produce the same lumpy, incoherent shapes as a normal photograph. They lack the perfect, mathematically precise distance mapping of the original. Second, the superficial penetration. In almost every replica, the coloring agent, whether pigment or chemical stain, soaks into the threads. It wicks between the fibers, following the capillaries of the linen. On the shroud, the image coloration exists only on the very topmost microfibers, a brittle crust on the surface with untouched, flexible linen underneath. No replica has successfully locked the image to the surface alone without any deeper penetration. Third, the absence of pigments. Replicas that use paints or dyes are immediately exposed by spectroscopic analysis, which detects the foreign substances. Even chemical methods often leave behind residue or byproducts that the shroud does not have. Fourth, the blood. Creating forensic serum halos around bloodstains with the correct chemistry of bilirubin and creatinine is a hurdle no artistic project has cleared. The blood on replicas looks painted because it is painted, lacking the complex biological story told by the stains on the Turin cloth. The sobering truth is that while many have recreated one or two characteristics in isolation, no one has ever produced an object that combines all of them simultaneously: the perfect negative, the three-dimensional data, the surface-only alteration, the lack of pigments, and the forensic blood chemistry. This consistent failure is not a minor detail, it is a deafening result. It means that with all our 21st century knowledge, materials, and intent, we cannot make another Shroud of Turin. This fact forces a humbling conclusion. If we cannot replicate it now with our advanced tools and understanding, the idea of a single medieval artist secretly developing and executing this technology, then vanishing without a trace, becomes an ever more staggering proposition. Yet the Shroud story does not live only in laboratories or ancient texts. It has woven itself into the very fabric of our modern imagination, becoming a star in its own right on screens and in bookstores. From dramatic Hollywood films to countless television documentaries, the linen cloth is often presented as the ultimate unsolved mystery, a puzzle box that holds the secrets of faith and history. These portrayals, whether leaning toward skepticism or belief, have profoundly shaped what the public thinks it knows. They frame the debate, introduce the controversies, and often end with that tantalizing, unanswered question, leaving viewers to decide for themselves. This cultural footprint expanded massively in 2015, when the shroud was displayed publicly in Turin for the first time in 5 years. For just over a month, more than 2 million pilgrims and curious visitors from around the globe stood in lines that snaked for hours, all for a fleeting moment in the cathedral's dim light. They came not just to see a relic, but to confront the mystery in person, to feel its silent pull. That immense draw speaks to something deeper than academic interest. It is a testament to the shroud's power as a cultural icon, an object that commands attention on a global scale. This enduring fascination fuels an endless ecosystem of speculation. Online forums and best-selling books buzz with theories that range from the meticulously researched to the wildly inventive. Some propose the image was created by a burst of divine light at the moment of resurrection, a supernatural explanation that resides firmly in the realm of faith. Others, searching for a human genius capable of such a feat, have pointed fingers at history's great polymaths, most notably Leonardo da Vinci. The Da Vinci theory suggests the Renaissance master, with his unparalleled knowledge of anatomy, optics, and chemistry, could have engineered the image as an elaborate commission, perhaps using an early camera obscura and a treated linen canvas. While mainstream historians and shroud researchers widely dismiss this for a lack of any evidence linking Leonardo to the cloth before his time, the theory's persistence is revealing. It shows how the human mind, confronted with an object that seems to defy its era, instinctively looks for a creator of matching, extraordinary genius. The shroud has transcended its physical form. It is no longer just an archaeological artifact or a religious relic. It is a blank screen onto which we project our deepest questions about art, science, history, and the divine. It lives in that fertile space where fact meets legend, and its true impact may be this: its uncanny ability to make millions of people, from devout believers to hardened skeptics, stop and wonder. The ultimate answers likely lie in tests that have not yet been invented. While the debate over the 1988 carbon dating remains a stalemate, future science offers a potential path forward through non-destructive techniques. Imagine a method that does not require cutting a single thread. One promising possibility is laser ablation mass spectrometry. Here, a tiny, precise laser pulse, finer than a human hair, could vaporize a microscopic amount of material from a single linen fiber. This minute sample, taken from multiple locations across the cloth, not just a suspect corner, would then be analyzed for its carbon content. This approach could theoretically map the age of the fabric point by point, revealing if certain areas, like the controversial sample corner, are chemically younger than the main body of the image. Another frontier is the continued advancement of textile analysis. Studying the degradation of the cellulose at a molecular level across the entire linen sheet could create a chronological map of its aging, independent of carbon dating entirely. Perhaps the most tantalizing future lies in particle physics. The radiation hypothesis for the image formation, that brief burst of energy, remains just a compelling idea. Future researchers may develop sophisticated new models to test what kind of particle emission, from protons to neutrons, could interact with linen to produce the exact superficial, three-dimensional negative we observe. Could a particle accelerator be used to fire a controlled beam at a linen sample, attempting to replicate the effect? Each of these avenues represents a move beyond debate and into the realm of definitive, measurable data. Yet all of this potential hinges on a single, profound question: will the cloth's guardians ever allow it? The Vatican, as the custodian of the shroud, faces an immense responsibility, balancing the desire for knowledge against the preservation of a sacred object venerated by millions. The fire of 1532 is a permanent reminder of the risks of physical harm. This makes any protocol that is even remotely destructive, any test that removes material or risks alteration, an extraordinarily difficult decision. The last major sampling for carbon dating left a visible hole in the cloth, a wound that has made authorities deeply cautious. Future research will almost certainly be governed by the principle of non-invasiveness. Any test permitted will need to be utterly safe, reversible, and conducted under the most stringent supervision. The goal is not to win an argument, but to steward a mystery. This means the next breakthrough may not come from a dramatic new cut of fabric, but from a quiet technological leap, a new way of seeing what has been in front of us all along. The next decade of imaging technology, artificial intelligence, and materials science holds incredible promise. We may one day have a scanner that can peer into the molecular history of every thread, or an algorithm that can finally decode the exact sequence of events that left that faint, straw-colored imprint. The journey of the Shroud of Turin is a story without an ending, a conversation between the past and the future that grows richer with every new tool we invent. It reminds us that some objects refuse to be categorized, stubbornly existing in the liminal space between artifact and icon, between memory and miracle. Whether one sees the face of faith or the fingerprint of an unknown natural process, the cloth continues to ask a question of us all: how do we confront the things we cannot yet explain? The mystery is far from closed. If anything, it is opening wider, inviting the next generation of scientists, historians, and seekers to look closer, to think deeper, and to wonder what secrets the next wave of light, be it from a laser or a new idea, might finally reveal. So we are left with a puzzle of immense scale, a tapestry woven from threads of faith, history, and forensic science. When we step back to weigh this new evidence as a whole, its cumulative weight becomes difficult to ignore. The single carbon-14 date from 1988, long the cornerstone of the forgery theory, now stands isolated and heavily contested, challenged by the compelling chemistry of an invisible medieval repair. Against that lone, disputed result, we must place an entire constellation of findings that point insistently eastward and backward in time. Middle Eastern pollen grains cling to the linen, whispering of Jerusalem's air. Microscopic limestone dust from Judean burial caves is embedded around the feet. The bloodstains behave with precise forensic realism, carrying the chemical markers of extreme trauma and forming serum halos no medieval artist would know to paint. The cloth itself is woven in a herringbone pattern known from 1st century Masada. The image, a superficial, pigment-free chemical change on the linen, encodes a perfect three-dimensional map of a human body, a feat of data storage that defies any known artistic method from any era. Individually, each piece of this evidence might be explained away with a clever hypothesis, but together they form a coherent pattern, a story that consistently pulls away from 14th century France and toward 1st century Judea. This is no longer a collection of anomalies, it is a converging path of material clues. The skeptical position, of course, remains robust and essential. It rightly demands extraordinary evidence for an extraordinary claim, and points to the lack of a definitive, uncontested historical paper trail before the 1350s. It highlights the human capacity for ingenious forgery and the powerful role of confirmation bias. The idea of a lost medieval genius, a master of anatomy, chemistry, and optics, creating this object as an act of profound devotion or deception, is a compelling narrative in its own right. It asks us to believe in a different kind of miracle, the miracle of human cunning. Yet the balance of the modern scientific evidence, as it has emerged in the decades since that carbon dating, is undeniably shifting. It is becoming increasingly difficult to construct a medieval forgery scenario that accounts for all the evidence simultaneously. How does a forger in 1300s France obtain and apply specific Jerusalem pollen and limestone? How do they paint blood with perfect serum halos and the biochemistry of torture? How do they create an image that is a photographic negative containing three-dimensional data without using any pigment at all? Each new attempt to answer these questions with medieval technology seems to stretch credulity further. The simpler, more elegant explanation emerging from the data is that the Shroud of Turin is exactly what it appears to be, the burial cloth of a crucified man from Roman-era Judea. The man's identity, of course, remains a matter of personal belief, forever beyond the reach of a microscope or a spectrometer. But the physical narrative inscribed on the linen, the story of a brutal Roman execution and a cloth that somehow captured a mysterious, inexplicable impression, is now supported by a formidable array of empirical clues. We are not looking at a painting of a crucifixion, we are looking at the potential forensic report of one. The central mystery, therefore, transforms. It is no longer primarily a question of authenticity versus forgery. The pressing, scientific question is now one of mechanism. How did that faint, perfect, three-dimensional image get onto the cloth? What natural or unique event involving a 1st century corpse and a length of linen could leave such a precise and enduring trace? This is where the deepest wonder resides, in that gap between the clear historical context and the utterly unexplained physical process. The shroud, in the end, may be less a holy icon to be venerated or a clever fake to be debunked, and more a profound scientific enigma waiting patiently for its final explanation. This incredible journey through faith, history, and science leaves us not with a simple answer, but with a richer, deeper mystery. We have traveled from the fire-scarred chapels of medieval France to the limestone tombs of ancient Jerusalem, from the controversies of a carbon dating lab to the silent verdict of a three-dimensional map. The evidence is a mosaic, and its picture is constantly shifting under new light. The Shroud of Turin remains an enigma, but it is no longer a static one. It is a living puzzle where every new discovery, from forensic blood chemistry to digital image analysis, actively reshapes the landscape of our understanding. The old, comfortable story of a medieval forgery now buckles under the weight of pollen from Jerusalem, limestone from its caves, and an image that behaves like data, not art. Yet the definitive proof, the single test that silences all doubt, remains just out of reach, waiting for a technology not yet invented or a permission not yet granted. This brings us to a final, provocative thought. Perhaps the ultimate question has quietly shifted. For centuries, we have been obsessed with how was this image made? But as the evidence for its ancient corporeal origin grows stronger, a more profound why begins to echo. Why would such an impossibly complex artifact, one that encodes a perfect three-dimensional negative with forensic blood details and Middle Eastern dust, be created at all? If it is a forgery, it is a work of such misguided, anachronistic genius that its creator remains the greatest ghost in history. If it is not, then we are left contemplating an object that witnessed a specific, brutal death, and then participated in a physical event so unique, so poorly understood, that it continues to defy our best tools and brightest minds. It stands as a permanent challenge at the boundary of the known, asking us to hold both reverence for faith and rigor for evidence in our minds at the same time. What do you think lies at the heart of this mystery? Share your own theories in the comments below. If you're fascinated by the places where history, science, and the unexplained collide, subscribe for more deep dives into the world's greatest puzzles. Keep questioning, keep wondering, and remember, the most compelling stories are often those that are still being written.